to give this paper in English will be clear from the paper itself. This paper is based on the argument that the Palestinian identity suffers from a serious terminological problem, in the sense that it is perceived by its carriers as one thing, while it is depicted in scholarly work as something totally different. I must admit that I have never seen this problem clearer and more apparent than in the papers presented in this conference yesterday. The clearest exception of that is the paper that was presented today of Ahmed Bakr, which gets very close to what I am going to establish here. But of course, all papers were great contributions, all were very informative and thought-provoking, but nearly all belong to one single paradigm, the paradigm that I think we have to break away from. It is the paradigm of making identity equivalent to awareness. This was implicit in most papers and explicit in many of them, but it was most explicitly stated by Mr. Samih Hamoudi yesterday, who insisted that identity is nothing but the awareness of self. Al-Wa'i bid-Dhat, he said. I totally disagree with this notion of identity, simply because it is a tautology, and a tautology is a logical fallacy. Because when you say that identity is the awareness of self, you are actually saying that self is the awareness of self. The logic goes this way. Identity is the awareness of self. Then national identity is the awareness of the national self. Then Palestinian identity is the awareness of the Palestinian self. My Palestinian identity is then my awareness of my Palestinianity. If I am aware of my Palestinianity, then I have a Palestinian identity. And if I am not aware of my Palestinianity, then I don't have a Palestinian identity. But if I don't have a Palestinian identity, then I am not Palestinian. And if I am not Palestinian, I don't have a Palestinianity. And if I don't have a Palestinianity, how can I be aware or not aware of it? It is clear from this that Palestinianity causally, logically, and ontologically precedes awareness. Therefore, awareness is not identity. Awareness is about identity. If identity is the object of awareness, how can the object of awareness be the product of awareness of what is logically conditioned by? So, how come that this way of thinking is the most powerful and most dominant paradigm even among Palestinian intellectuals and thinkers? And if Palestinian identity is not awareness, so what is it? This is what I am going to explain to you. And in my explanation of this, I will move from the most obvious to the most unusual, and that to the most obvious again. The most obvious is that our world today is made of national states. That is, of states having their own nations and of nations having their own states. The World Union of States is not called the United States, it is called the United Nations, whereas the states are implied in the assumption that states are the political systems of nations. In this modern world order, those peoples who do not have a state of their own are not considered a nation. And since they are not considered a nation, they are not entitled to have their own state. This is the cause of the case of the Kurds in Turkey, the Basques in Spain, the Britons in France, the Hutu in Rwanda, and the Palestinians wherever they are. Since these peoples do not have their own states, they are left out of the world order of national states. When the nation is made identical with the state, nationality is made identical with citizenship. Those who do not have a state of their own do not have a citizenship of their own. And therefore, they do not have a nationality of their own. Thus, the state defines the nation, Nation defines nationality. From nationality comes the national, and from the national comes national identity. With simple logical inference, we reach the conclusion that those who do not have a state of their own do not have a national identity. This is the paradox of peoples who do not have or have not managed to have a state of their own. They have no national identity. This implies that the Kurds, the Basques, the Britons, the Hutu, and the Palestinians have no national identity. Their Kurdish, Basque, Breton, Hutu, or Palestinian identities can be cultural, tribal, ethnic, or geosocial, or whatever you call it, but not national identity, since they are not a nation in a national state and have no nationality of their own. I will get to that. Western researchers were caught in this paradox when they discovered that this universalized European definition of national identity stands in plain contrast to their observations in the field. Empirical research was driving them to the conclusion that peoples who do not have a state of their own possess and manifest even stronger national characteristics than those members of nations in national states. Due to this growing critical awareness of this paradox, Western scholars such as Gregory Bateson, Anthony Giddens, Anthony Smith, and Benedict Anderson tried to solve this paradox at the theoretical level by loosening up the tight bond between national identity and the state. They then defined national identity in terms of persons' identification, either with a collectivity having its own national state or with a collectivity aspiring for and trying to obtain its own national state. According to this definition, the Kurds, the Basques, the Hutu, and the Palestinians also have a national identity, but not the Britons, because the Britons in France do not aspire for nor try to have their own state. It is not difficult to see, however, that these scholars solved a paradox with an ambivalence. For how can you define people's identity in reference to something that does not exist? If national identity stems from belonging to a community of people defined as a political entity, and the community of people is defined by the political system called the state, doesn't this then mean that the absence of the state implies the absence of the community, which in turn implies the absence of national identity? One way to escape from this entanglement is to consider national identity in such cases as a project in the process, not as a state in the present. National identity as such is considered to be stemming from belonging to a group of people engaged in the process of community construction and nation building. It is defined in terms of nation to be and state to be. But this definition suffers from two serious problems. One is that it makes the present contingent on the future and defines people's identity now in terms of what will happen or not happen in the future. If the Palestinians manage to achieve an independent state of their own, then they have and have had a national identity. If they fail to achieve an independent state, however, then they do not have a national identity. And then, excuse me? Who's talking? And then we go back from the future to judge the past, which is now present, and decide that the Palestinians have never had a national identity. They have never been Palestinian. The other problem with this definition is that of the irrationality of defining actions by their results and defining objects by their purposes. It's like saying the neck is a neck because if it were not a neck, our head would be stuck into our bodies and we would not be able to look around. If you succeed, you are something. If you don't succeed, then you are nothing, and you have never been anything. This definition of national identity as a project towards the future and the empirical and logical problems inherent in it has led most scholars to reduce national identity from a mode of being and living to a mental state, a psychological condition that is liable to infinite speculations and not non-verifiable assumptions, from an awakening of awareness to an imagined community, or to paraphrase Stephen Taylor, from a fantasy reality to a reality of fantasy. This has sparked a wave of all kinds of writings on the construction of national identity, on the reconstruction of the past for the construction of identity in the present, on the role of selective memory and remembering in national identity formation, on national identity as an imagined reality, on the instrumentality of national identity, and on the manipulative nature of national identity. Even more, some scholars went to the extent of investigating the emergence of certain national identities, such as the emergence of Palestinian identity. Some even dared to specify a certain date of birth for the Palestinian national identity and engaged themselves in an endless debate on the birthday of Palestinianity, whether it is 1964, 1948, 1947, 1922, 1919, or 1917. Some were so generous to trace our Palestinian identity so far back as to the emergence of the Zionist movement in the late 1880s. Prior to that date of birth, there was no Palestinian national identity because the Arab population in the territory known as Palestine did not have a collective awareness as a distinct people, so there was no Palestinian people, so there were no Palestinians. The true implication of such reasoning is this: we are Palestinian today. Our parents, some were Palestinian, some were not. Our grandparents most likely were not Palestinian. The parents of our grandparents most definitely were not Palestinian. While the Jews and the Israelites, they have been Jewish and Israelites for 3,000 years. And I really wonder why it is acceptable and legitimate for the Israelis and the Jews to trace their identity back to David, and when we Palestinians trace our identity back to Goliath, it becomes so unacceptable. And why the Jews, when they take their roots back to even to Abraham, then it is history. And when we trace ourselves back only 100 years, it becomes a fabrication. There is still another serious problem with this definition of the national identity of stateless people. When the national identity of such people is defined in terms of the aspiration for and the struggle to achieve an independent state, in today's world order, this aspiration and struggle will always clash with the aspirations of one or more states that will do their best to dismantle these people's aspiration, quell their struggle, demonize their national identity, and even annihilate the group itself. As such, the aspiration of such stateless people for an independent state will always be considered an aspiration away from an existing state. And their struggle for independence will always be considered a struggle against the sovereignty of someone else. The Kurds against Turkey, the Basque against Spain, the Hutu against the Tutsi, and the Palestinians nearly against the whole world. In this sense, the national identity of stateless people will always be contested and counteracted, and therefore it will always be resilient, fragile, conditional, not completely legitimate, and not completely real. If national identity is defined and determined by what it is against, national identity is then deprived of substantial content and of an existence on its own. Not only that, even at the ontological level, national identity defined as such is reduced into nothing but the antithesis of what it is against. The antithesis of another national identity, that of the state that this identity is struggling against. It emerges as a reaction to the other identity. It is constructed in order to deconstruct the other identity, and it derives its raison d'etre from the existence and duration of the other identity. No wonder thus that the literature is abundant with sophisticated academic works that seriously argue that the Palestinian identity emerged as a reaction to Zionism, and that Palestinians owe their Palestinianity, even their existence as Palestinians, to Zionism and its national project in Palestine. At this point, this track of theorization on national identity meets with the second track, the track of political scientists who still perceive national identity as a political construct in or toward a national state, thus making the national identity of stateless people identical with national liberation movements. The emergence of national movement means the emergence of the national identity. The success of the national movement means the legitimation of national identity. And the failure of the national movement means the disintegration of its people and the disappearance of its national identity. For these scholars, Palestinian identity is restricted to and is indistinguishable from the Palestinian national liberation movement as expressed in Palestinian national parties and Palestinian national organizations. It is emerged in the 1930s through the parties of the Nashashibis, Husseinis, and others. It was knocked out and nearly eradicated in 1948, and then it had to wait until 1964 when the charismatic leader Yasser Arafat with the help of Abdul Nasser, revived it, or some even say reinvented it. On the other hand, the Palestinian identity, according to this track of scholars, is restricted to those who join the national project of Palestinian national organizations. Those who do not, such as the Palestinians in Israel, are not Palestinian. They are Israeli Arabs. As you can see, these scholars give themselves the right to decide who is Palestinian and who is not. Leaving all theoretical acrobatics aside, I personally do not find myself nor my Palestinianity in this theoretical portrait of national identity. After lifelong praxis as a Palestinian, and after several decades of investigations and reflection, I argue that the so-called national identity is not only a mental state. Whether it is collective or individual, whether it is awareness or imagination. National identity is also behavior. Not behavior in the sense of political activism and national struggle, but a mundane behavior in the praxis of everyday life. Furthermore, the so-called national identity is not only awareness and behavior, simply because national awareness and behavior derive their existence from something beyond them, something existentially prior to them. Hence, I argue, the real essence of the so-called national identity is a sense of belonging. A general, subconscious, subliminal, inarticulate, and very often non-articulable sense similar to Pierre Bourdieu's habitus. This sense of belonging may generate concomitant sentiments. It may generate concomitant behavior, and it may even generate concomitant awareness or any other mental state at the level of consciousness. But even if it doesn't, its existential status remains unaffected because its existence is not contingent on its subsequent outcome. The essence of the so-called national identity is therefore a sense of belonging. But a sense of belonging to what? Not to a nation, because nations are artificial constructs. Not to a state either, because states come and go, but to a homeland. And the homeland is exactly what it is. It's exactly what it says. A homeland. It begins with home and ends with land. It is a sense of belonging to a home house and home family, to a home quarter and home neighborhood, to a home hara and home hamula, to a home village and home village community, to a home region and region inhabitants, and to homeland and home people. What could be stronger proof of this than the program of this conference? The English program speaks about the Palestinian national identity. The Arabic program, however, speaks about al-hawiyya al-wataniyya al-Palestinian. Watan is a homeland, a patria, not a nation. And Watani is patriotic, not national. Sha'b al-Palestini, the Palestinian people, that is the people of Palestine, not the people of a Palestinian national state. This is not only a matter of wars and innocent language games and language differences. It is rather a matter of power and hegemony. Translation here is transformation. It does not only replace one word with another. It replaces one perception, one experience, one mode of being, one sense and essence with another. When we think in English, we think English. We think the way English-speaking people taught us to think, want us to think, and accept our thoughts when we tell them what we think. Western scholars do not really mind how we perceive things, but how we perceive their perception of our perception of things. They imposed on our perception their perception of the world, and their perception of the world is that of economically oriented political institution in the sense of competitive sovereign states of exclusive nations. How did they manage to do that? By redefining and reordering our world and having the power to force us either to accept their world order or to vanish from history and from the business of the modern world. Because the modern world is a Western-formed world divided into national states, and the national state is a relatively new phenomenon that emerged in Europe after the French Revolution towards the end of the 18th century, and was coercively imposed on the rest of the world through two centuries of colonialism, 2 world wars, and 2 cold wars. When we have a homeland. Yes.
ممكن لانه في بدنا نعطي مجال للاسئله.
اوكي.
هذا كله حساب الغداء
اوكي. Let me say, truly the Palestine throughout history has been either divided into small pieces or swallowed by huge monsters. Division is also our reality today, and inclusion in larger entities, Arab or Muslim, could also become our reality in the future. Yet Palestine, as the site of Palestinian mode of being and living, has always been unique and distinct, and as such it will remain. It belonged to Damascus, but it never became Syrian. It belonged to Sidona or Beirut, but it never became Lebanese. It belonged to Cairo, but it never became Egyptian. Now it is a ruined and ravaged land lying as an archaeological layer underneath the Western Zionist colonial project that tries to eliminate its Palestinianity. But for Palestinians, it is still and will continue to be Palestine, their homeland. On this background, we should understand the significance of the Nakba for exiled Palestinians, and on this background we can understand why the 48 Palestinians still refer to the catastrophe of 1948 as لما احتلوا اليهود, when the occupied it took the land. You want me to finish? Absolutely. This is the last paragraph I will read. From this perception, yes. I do not say that Palestinianity is inherited through genes, nor do I say that Palestinianity runs in our blood, nor that it is the substance of our bodies or our genealogy. But one thing I say, Palestinianity is us. It is how we live, how we think, how we talk, and how we interact. We feel in a Palestinian way, we perceive in a Palestinian way, we marry and carry and deliver in a Palestinian way, we love and hate in a Palestinian way, we are a human in a Palestinian way, and we die in a Palestinian way. I may not be aware of my Palestinianity.
هذا قصة بريق الزيت.
Okay. I will.
آخر جملة.
The conclusion, I want to make a conclusion that is relevant to this conference. First of all, I am not afraid. I do not see the failure of establishing a Palestinian state as a threat to Palestinian identity. Palestinian identity, it does exist without a state, and it will exist with or without a state. The second thing, what really threatens Palestinian identity is anything that threatens our Palestinian sense of belonging to Palestine as our homeland. And therefore, I cannot emphasize how important it is with our cultural heritage and folklore, because that is our way, our mode of being Palestinian. It is not only a symbol for our identity, it is our identity. Thank you very much.
شكرا كثير دكتور مسلم.